Tonight we have a very interesting speaker, Tony Kronman, who has a very interesting educational background. He has a PhD, or a doctorate I should say, both in philosophy and in law. He is the Sterling Professor of Law at Yale. He has been for, I think, more than a decade, Dean of the law school at Yale. He is on leave there, and we are very honored to have him here as a global professor at NYU Abu Dhabi. Tonight, Tony Kronman is going to speak about a topic that highly interests me, and therefore I feel very guilty that as soon as he has taken the podium, I have to leave. So don't see this as an indication that the Institute would not be interested in the topic. On the contrary, I feel very guilty, but he knows that I have to leave. The topic, namely, is about liberal education. The topic of tonight's talk is the case for liberal education. I was a little surprised that he didn't say the case for liberal arts education, but I invite him to comment on that. In order for you to understand why I think this is so important, apart from the fact that we advertise ourselves, and we are a liberal arts college that many of you know and live this very moment. But we also know that being a liberal arts college in our modern times is something that we cannot live, if you will, in purity. That is not, we cannot live it in the way that it became very popular in the Anglo-Saxon world, I would say by the mid-19th century. Whether I'm right or wrong, probably I'm wrong, to call ourselves a hybrid. I'm probably wrong in saying so, but what I mean is that we are in tension between the liberal arts ideal of education and all kinds of external pressures, whether it is from the ideal of the von Humboldt Universität, the research university that was created 200 years ago in Germany, or whether we are under pressure from, let us say, our own ideals of what we could achieve in society with a specialized degree that reflects the demands of being an economist or a doctor or a law professor. So the pressure that we all feel as academics or as possible future academics to profile ourselves as fast as we can, as soon as we can, in our undergraduate studies, to focus on a particular discipline. These are pressures that do not always sit easily with the educational model of the liberal arts. I will not go into, Professor Kronman may do so or not, I will not go into the history of the term, the artes liberales, what they stood for in the Middle Ages. Let me just, from a very personal point of view, say one or two words why I think that I would love to have Professor Kronman as a teacher. He has taught in January 2012 a course in Florence called The Miracle of Florence. And mind you, as I said, he has a doctorate in law and in philosophy. I think next year he's going to teach on Kant and Nietzsche, I think he told me. Now, please listen to the very brief blurb that he conceived for his course, being a law professor and having this law and philosophy background. So he advertised his January course as follows. In the 15th and 16th centuries, and I'm an art historian, you must know. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the city of Florence was a center of immense creativity in every area of human understanding and endeavor. It was the center of that extraordinary moment we call the Renaissance, the revolution in art, architecture, politics, philosophy, and science that has shaped our view of the world and the place of human beings in it. In this seminar, he says, we read representative writings from several of the great Florentine thinkers of the period, Alberti, Machiavelli, Pico, and Galileo. Our goal is twofold, he advertises his course. And the water comes into my mouth, as we say in Dutch. To discover what was original in each, and to grasp how all were connected by a shared set of ideals and beliefs. Our readings and discussions are supplemented by visits to the main cultural monuments of Florence, where we see, among other wonders, the palaces and churches that Alberti designed, the telescope through which Galileo spied the moons of Jupiter, and the tomb which where Machiavelli lies. I wish I would have written these lines, but these are his. I would have loved, as an art historian, as a student in art history, to take his class, because I think this is one of the best descriptions of an art history class that I could imagine. Professor Kronman is very famous for a book that he titled Education's End: Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. I dare to challenge you in your mind that if you listen tonight to Professor Kronman's expositions on the importance of the liberal arts education and the importance of questions of meaning of life and the role of universities and colleges in finding answers, in formulating answers, I want to keep you in mind that I would love to have him not only as an art history professor, but as a kind of a global liberal arts professor at our college. Ladies and gentlemen, please applaud Professor Kronman.
Thank you so much, Reindert. It is just wonderful to be back here in Abu Dhabi. I've seen some old friends this trip and made some new ones, and it's been a particular pleasure for me to reconnect with some of my former NYU Abu Dhabi students. So thank you very much for inviting me back. This evening, I shall say a few words in defense of liberal education. But first, of course, I need to tell you what it is I mean to defend. The phrase liberal education is one of those hazy generalities that means many things, and often, it seems, nothing at all. This is surprising, perhaps, in light of the fact that many schools, in the United States at least, profess a commitment to the ideals of liberal education and indeed define themselves by their devotion to it. To what then does the phrase refer? I should emphasize at the start that this is a question of capital importance to all of us involved in the remarkable adventure called NYU Abu Dhabi, which aims to give its students, who have been drawn together from all over the world, what its founders call an education in the liberal arts. We can best get our bearings, I think, if we begin at the beginning, which in this case means with the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who wrote and taught in the 4th century before the Common Era. Aristotle's philosophy played a central role in the development of Western culture. His views have had a lasting influence on many areas of thought. One of these is the field of education. According to Aristotle, every art of any complexity requires an education of some sort. It demands training and preparation. Naturally, this training takes different forms in different fields. In many, it consists in practicing the skills of the art or craft in question under the watchful eye of a seasoned master who guides and corrects the stumbling efforts of his or her younger apprentice. Today we call this kind of education on-the-job training. It's the way, for example, that one learns to be an automobile mechanic or a painter of portraits. When, as a young boy, Michelangelo showed a talent for painting, his father apprenticed him to an older painter named Ghirlandaio. Michelangelo learned to paint on the job. Until quite recently, historically speaking, this was also the way that lawyers in the United States and in Great Britain learned their craft as well, by practicing the law under the supervision of a veteran with long experience in the art. Some disciplines call for an education of a less practical kind. One learns them not by practice, but study. The difference is, of course, one of degree. Most practical arts, those, for example, that an electrician or architect or ship captain pursues, generally require a period of study before one begins to learn by doing, and even the most abstract and impractical arts, theoretical physics, for example, or moral philosophy, typically involve an intellectual testing of hypotheses that resembles, in a way, the more practical experiments of a young artisan who is trying to get a feel for his or her craft. Still, there are some forms of education that are clearly more theoretical than others, using that word in the original Greek sense to mean detached from the demands of practical life. At the furthest end of this spectrum lie those sorts of learning that are almost entirely detached in this way. They take place largely or entirely in school, a word whose Greek root means leisure or freedom from labor. Aristotle's distinction between the practical and theoretical arts is familiar enough and reasonable as far as it goes. But his judgment regarding the significance of this distinction may seem less obvious to many today. According to Aristotle, the practical arts are all essentially unfree. This is true, he says, for two reasons. The first is that every practical art is directed toward the attainment of some limited goal, which confines those who practice it within a narrow range of attention and skill. It makes no difference whether the end is one we regard as having a high status or a low one instead. In Aristotle's view, every practical art is confining simply by virtue of being oriented toward the achievement of a specific and concrete end whose attainment demands that the person pursuing it do so in a deliberately single-minded way. Aristotle thought that such narrowness of outlook and attention must inevitably cause a narrowing of the person's soul as well, which is bound, he says, to become cramped and constricted on account of the habit of looking at things from the limited point of view that every practical task imposes on those who take it up. The second reason why the practical arts are unfree, according to Aristotle, is that all of them have as their goal, in one way or another, the satisfaction of some bodily need. The end of the art of farming, for example, is the production of food. The end of the art of building, the provision of shelter. Everyone who pursues a practical art therefore works in the service of need, and this, Aristotle says, necessarily gives his or her work a servile character. By contrast, those who are engaged in the useless theoretical pursuits of philosophy and mathematics and the allied disciplines of astronomy and musical theory serve no need other than their desire to know, to understand the world for the sake of such understanding alone. In Aristotle's view, this is not a need, like the need for food or shelter, that ties us down and keeps us chained within the routines of bodily life but one that sets us free instead, that leads us on to wider and deeper perspectives, and in the end to an understanding of the order of the cosmos as a whole. If the practical arts, which are driven by the needs of the body, promote a narrowing of attention and concern, the theoretical arts, which are independent of such needs, thus carry us in the opposite direction toward forms of understanding that take in more and more, not less and less. For both the reasons I have mentioned, then, Aristotle judged the theoretical arts to be preeminently free, and the souls of those who follow them freer as well, more spacious and less confined by the demands of animal need than the souls of the practitioners of the practical arts, however prestigious and well-paid the latter may be. Aristotle's judgment became the basis for the distinction, which later Roman writers codified, between the liberal and illiberal arts. The root meaning of liberal is free. The liberal arts are the ones that promote the freedom of the soul, in Aristotle's sense, that lead it away from physical need and from the narrowness of vision that attends every practical undertaking toward larger and more purely intellectual objects that invite us to consider the world as a God might, unconcerned, for a while at least, with the clamorous needs of our bodies. For a man who wishes to live a free life in Aristotle's sense, and I hardly need to remind you that Aristotle believed that only men are capable of such a life, it followed that an education in the liberal arts is the only sort appropriate to his ambition. Others who wish to pursue a trade or practice a craft, or who are tied to the needs of their bodies by ignorance and poverty, have neither the time nor inclination for an education of this kind. Liberal education is for the few and the free. It is inherently elitist. Today, we find this troubling. But for the Romans, who built a philosophy of education on Aristotle's distinction between the servility of the practical arts and the freedom of the theoretical branches of learning, the elitism of their program of study was a recommendation, not an objection. To follow the later path of these ideas in Western culture would be more than one night's work. But as the centuries whirl past, we can perhaps note a milestone or two along the way. As political authority crumbled in the ruined empire of the West and the glittering cities of the pagan world fell into disuse and decay, the ideals of liberal education, like most of the cultural treasures of that vanishing world, were preserved and carried forward by the Christian Church. The liberal arts of philosophy and mathematics and logic and music and grammar continued to be taught, haphazardly at least, in the new cathedral schools that grew up around the great centers of worship, in order that young men aspiring to a place in the church might be properly trained for their work. This meant, of course, that these ancient disciplines had somehow to be joined with the study of Scripture and Christian theology, which in many ways was hostile to the deepest premises of pagan thought. The educational program that resulted was an uneasy amalgam of pagan philosophy and Christian doctrine, and though some tried to achieve a reconciliation between these two, their efforts were never entirely successful. when the first real universities began to appear in the slowly reviving West in the 12th and 13th centuries, they inherited this program of education along with the tensions inherent in it, and later exported both to the rest of the world. Among these universities, the name with its modern connotations is misleading for a number of reasons. Cambridge and Oxford were two of the most influential. By the turn of the 17th century, they had more or less perfected a system of education based on the medieval model, which in turn was shaped by the ancient Roman theory of the liberal arts, itself ultimately derived from Aristotle's distinction between practical and theoretical study, all with a very heavy Christian accent. Students read Aristotle and Euclid and Cicero and the Bible and various theological commentaries in a highly structured format whose goal was the production, if I may put it this way, of Christian gentlemen, of free men with spacious souls attuned to the greatest things, yet humble before God. The religious refugees who founded Harvard College in 1636 were nearly all graduates of Cambridge. And when they established the first institution of higher education in America, they naturally looked to their alma mater for a model. With some modest tinkering here and there, the Harvard curriculum set the pattern for American education for the next 200 years. In 1860, 2 centuries after the founding of Harvard College, the American landscape was dotted with colleges from coast to coast. Everywhere that Americans went, it seems, they first built a church and then immediately afterwards a college. The residential liberal arts college is one of the great monuments of American civilization. In 1860, there were hundreds of such colleges from New England to the shores of California, and the students in them continued to read many of the same books that had formed the core of the Harvard curriculum, with some modern additions, of course, in a program of study whose goal could still be described as the production of free men, and by that time, a few free women too, though with a gradually declining emphasis on religious belief. This was far removed from the program of liberal education that the great Roman writers on the subject had conceived so many centuries before, but they, and Aristotle too, would have recognized something familiar in the ideal of a free human life that remained at the heart of liberal learning in America long after the founding of the first American college. This ideal might be described in the following way. The point of a liberal arts education is not to prepare one for a career. It is not to train one for a job. It is something larger and freer than that. A liberal arts education broadens one's horizons. It liberates the young man or woman who experiences it from prejudice of every kind. It sets the student free from the chance circumstances of family and faith. It dissolves the limits of whatever upbringing he or she happens to have received. Liberal education is opposed to servility in all its forms. It is the antidote to servility, to the tyranny of need and belief, and the deformations of habit that come with every practical task, and its inevitable servitude to the demands of the work at hand. This is the manifesto of liberal learning. Aristotle would have understood and approved its basic message, and 100 years ago, few college teachers in America would have disputed its truth. Even today, one hears versions of it repeated with conviction in baccalaureate addresses and commencement speeches every year. And yet, there is something about it that now rings a little hollow, and one wonders whether those who defend the ideals of liberal learning still really believe what they say. For the course of higher education everywhere, not just in the United States, but everywhere, has turned in a direction that is deeply hostile to these ideals themselves. I have in mind, Reiner alluded to it, the rise of the modern research university. The first true research universities were established in Germany in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and from there exported to America and eventually to the rest of the world. In essence, a research university is an institution for the production of new knowledge. Its goal is to increase the stockpile of existing knowledge by assembling the researchers that are needed to do this and providing them with the equipment they require. Among other things, this entails an ever finer division of academic labor, mirroring the division of labor in the world at large. To make an effective contribution to knowledge in any branch of study today, a scholar must devote him or herself exclusively to a single subject, indeed often to a single author or problem or period within his or her chosen field. Dilettantism is the enemy of research. It can produce nothing of value. Like productivity outside the university, productivity within it demands that every academic worker pay exclusive attention to one small corner of the endless range of things that are worth researching, and disregard, or at least disown any right to a say in, what's happening in other departments of research down the hall. The ideal of the research university today defines the aims and aspirations of every leading institution of higher education in the world, from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Qatar. In one way, of course, the research ideal is perfectly compatible with Aristotle's distinction between theoretical and practical knowledge. Some research may, of course, have practical value, but its essential goal is not to produce useful things. It is to understand the world for the sake of such understanding. Basic research is not driven by any need other than the need to know. In this sense, it is supremely, sublimely free. But in another, the modern research university is utterly antithetical to Aristotle's conception of liberal learning. For by requiring the researcher to become a specialist, as he or she must, the modern university discourages and indeed systematically devalues the broad and unspecialized forms of knowledge that Aristotle associated with freedom in general, and promotes the narrowing of vision and interest that he thought characteristic of an unfree or illiberal mind. The triumph of the research ideal has been so complete that it no longer requires defenders. Its value goes without saying. This presents a tremendous challenge to those who still feel an attachment to the values of liberal education, because from the vantage point of the modern research university, these values can only look like an anachronism or something worse, a self-serving sort of amateurish nonsense, blind to the requirements of science, hostile to progress, and indefensibly elitist to boot. Liberal education, of course, hasn't died away. There are many thriving liberal arts colleges in America, and most of its great research universities house undergraduate liberal arts programs within them. There have even been a few new and daring experiments in liberal education, of which NYU Abu Dhabi is an outstanding example. On the surface, it might therefore seem that liberal education is not in any real danger at all, that it has found a way to live alongside the research university, and that its future is secure. If by secure one means only that programs of liberal education are unlikely to disappear anytime soon, there's little reason to worry. But if one means that the values of liberal learning are today clearly understood or even confidently held by those who profess allegiance to them, then there is more reason for doubt. Every liberal arts program in the world today lives in the shadow of the research university and must justify itself in a culture of academic specialization that runs against the grain of its own deepest ideals. This explains, I think, the note of anxiety that one often hears in the justifications that are offered in its defense, and the tendency of those who speak on behalf of its ideals to grant the premises of the system of specialized work, of which the modern research university is an integral part. I want briefly to consider two of these justifications and then to offer one of my own. The first can be put in the following way. Far from making a liberal arts education less important, the explosion of knowledge that is responsible for the ever-increasing division of labor, both within and without the university, makes it more important instead. The more there is to know within any given field, the more important it is that one be a discriminating consumer of the relevant knowledge. This means that one must be able to tell what knowledge is relevant and to make appropriate use of it. But that requires something more than mere technical know-how. It requires judgment and taste. It demands independence of mind and the ability to judge for oneself which claims to truth and relevance ought to be acknowledged and why. Otherwise, one is bound to be buffeted about by the opinions of others and by the imperious demands of technical knowledge with no sure basis on which to choose or act. The best preparation for choice and action in a world of this sort is a liberal arts education that exposes one to a variety of different points of view and traditions of thought, and thereby encourages the habits of critical reflection and independent mindedness that one must possess in order to move nimbly and confidently in an environment in which it is easy to be overwhelmed by the ever-growing flood of technical knowledge. Today, most important jobs require such knowledge, but to use it well and responsibly, the technical know-how our jobs demand must be filtered and weighed by a mind that possesses the powers of observation and judgment, that a general non-vocational introduction to the main forms of human thought and experience is best equipped to produce. In a world in which the technical requirements of work force us into ever narrower channels of mindless obedience, those who have had a liberal arts education are in the best position to lead rather than follow, and to create rather than blindly defer. The second justification has special application to NYU Abu Dhabi. It goes something like this. The world in which we live today divides us, as I've just suggested, into increasingly isolated realms of expertise. But it also draws us together into a planetary community of human beings whose fates are linked in countless ways, economically, politically, environmentally, and culturally. No one today is just a member of this or that ethnic group, a believer in this or that God, a citizen of this or that state. We are all citizens of the world as well, and as such have responsibilities that are at least different from, and one day soon may be viewed as superior to, the responsibilities we have as members of all the other lesser communities to which we belong. How can we best prepare to meet our responsibilities as citizens of the world? Once again, no amount of technical training can do this. Something broader and more spacious is required. Above all, what is needed is the tolerance and generosity of spirit that allows one to appreciate the value in diversity and the non-sectarian wisdom to design institutions that are able to accommodate the differences among people and to convert these from a source of hatred and war into one of productivity and enjoyment instead. These too are qualities that a liberal education seeks to foster. By exposing students to the diversity of views about what is good and valuable and true that are embodied in the greatest of our human achievements, in philosophy and art and politics and the astounding adventure of science, and by helping them to find what is best in all these works and ideas, regardless of the student's own initial beliefs, a program of liberal education trains students in the practice of the intellectual and spiritual generosity on which every genuine and durable regime of tolerance must be founded. And by helping them to see all these things from a point of view that is hostage to none, it prepares them for the work of fashioning the ecumenical framework of a global civilization that delights in diversity rather than fears it. For those who aspire to lead this work, a liberal education is the best preparation of all. Others may put the case for liberal education in somewhat different terms or place the emphasis at different points. But the two justifications I have just sketched are familiar ones and have many supporters today. Their appeal depends on the fact that they employ the very features of our world that seem to place the value of liberal learning in doubt. On the one hand, the increasingly technical character of the knowledge on which most of the important jobs in the world now depend, and on the other, the erasure of the cultural boundaries that in the past made it possible to identify such learning with the works and ideas of one civilization alone. They employ these features of the world in which we live today to construct a new defense of liberal education, and in this fashion, through a kind of intellectual jujitsu, to exploit their enemy's strength against them. This is a powerful response, I would say a wonderful response, and a good one. And I endorse it without qualification. Still, the justifications, the two that I have outlined, seem to me to leave something out of account. In their rush to make a place for liberal learning in the technocratic and global world in which we live, they overlook what to my mind is the first and most important value in an education of this kind. This is the value of liberality itself, of that freedom in living that for Aristotle represented the summit of human existence. Let me explain. Today, nearly all of us must work for a living. The only exceptions are the very rich. And many of us who must work have some choice, at least in what we do. The only exceptions are the very poor. But work is not the same as living. It is only one part of it. It is a very important part, to be sure. It is a source of income, and beyond that, if we are fortunate, of many personal satisfactions as well. If we are lucky, our work gives us the chance to exercise our talents and to collaborate with others in meaningful and constructive pursuits. Aristotle viewed labor, the work that we must do in order to live, as a necessity and hence servile by nature. It never occurred to him to think that one might find satisfactions of a truly worthy kind in the domain of work itself. In this respect, his view of work differs sharply from ours, which is shaped by the Abrahamic belief that work is a morally and spiritually rewarding activity. Yet, however important we believe it to be, work is not the whole of life, which includes much else besides. And while a liberal education can help one choose a line of work that is likely to be suitable and fulfilling, and then to make use of the knowledge the work requires in an independent-minded and judicious way, this is not its only or highest value. The highest value of a liberal education is that it helps us to see there is a question that lies beyond the realm of vocational choice altogether. The question of what one's life as a whole is for, of what gives one's career as a human being, as distinct from one's career as a lawyer or engineer or teacher or doctor or diplomat, its ultimate meaning and value. The question of what life as a whole is for also remains to be asked and answered, even after one has arrived at a defensible view of what one's responsibilities are as a citizen of the global republic to which we now all belong. The latter condition is a common, indeed universal one. It is a role we all share. Though what we must do to fulfill its requirements depend on the particular place we occupy in the global distribution of power and wealth. Yet even after we have defined the requirements of this role and decided how best to meet them, a further question remains. That is the question of how to spend our lives, the most precious and unique resource we possess. My life is not a common role I share with others. It is mine and mine alone. And while a liberal education can help form the habits of tolerance on which effective and responsible global citizenship depends, once again it has a larger and higher task. For after we have come to a reasonable understanding of what such citizenship entails, we still must face the larger question of what it is about ourselves and about the world as it appears to us from the vantage point of our singular experience of it that makes life worth living at all. There is no question beyond this one. With it, all our questioning comes to an end, and the greatest value of a liberal education is not that it equips us with the powers of critical thought that we need to navigate in an increasingly technocratic world, or with the tolerance for diversity on which the future of humankind does indeed depend, but that it helps us face with as much honesty as we can and to answer as best as we are able the exquisitely personal question of the meaning of life that no one ever evades except through self-deceit. I hasten to add that very few of us, if any, ever answer this question decisively and once and for all. For most of us, the question of the meaning of life remains unsettled as long as we live. The answers we give to it are provisional and incomplete. They change from one year and decade to the next. In this respect, we are all works in progress, and we remain so until we die. This is part of the human condition. Yet, even so, there is a difference, I would say a very large difference, between those who see the seriousness of this question and give it a place in their lives, and those who just drift along, mindlessly answering it by their actions without ever having really framed the question for themselves. The latter give the impression of being settled and content, but that is only because they are in an important way closed off from themselves and from the mysterious and baffling question of the meaning of life. The former seem more troubled, and they are, but that is because they have found the strength to bring this question into view and to face it directly. To repeat, facing the question of the meaning of life does not mean putting it to rest. It can't be put to rest. But while those who struggle with it lead lives that are more troubled than those who do not, their lives are also more free in the most important sense of this word. They are on their way. None of us is ever more than on the way. They are on the way to taking possession of themselves, as opposed to simply going with the flow. And though such possession is never final or complete, and is vulnerable to disruption by forces from within and without, its achievement, however fragile, is the most astounding form of freedom that any human being ever enjoys. This is the sort of freedom that a liberal education promotes. It does so by placing before us a range of conflicting answers to the question of the meaning of life, answers that at once attune us to the urgency of the question and underscore the impossibility of ever finding an answer by just looking in a book or turning to an authority of some sort for an answer. Anyone who has experienced such an education in the spirit in which it is intended will be more troubled and confused, but also freer than before. Along the way, he or she will have acquired much valuable knowledge of the methods and discoveries of natural science, of the strengths and weaknesses of different forms of human government, of the main varieties of religious belief, and much, much else besides. But the student who has had a liberal education will also have acquired something far more precious as well. a restless, lifelong attention to the question of the meaning of life, and a library of works to which he or she can return in the way one resumes a conversation with old friends, as the question reasserts itself from time to time in the weather of life's changing seasons. And in this respect, they will be freer, much freer, than they were before their education began. Freer, one might say, to be a human being, and freer in the work of being one, though none of us ever does this work as completely or well as we wish. This is the liberation in liberal education, and it brings me back to where I began. For though the idea of freedom that I have just invoked is deeply different from Aristotle's own, it rests on an equation similar to the one that underlies his classical conception of liberal learning. This is the equation of freedom with the most active form of human living, and of both of these with a course of study that aims to go beyond the requirements of practical life. We believe, as Aristotle did not, that women are as fit for such an education as men. And we deny what Aristotle affirmed, that some must be slaves in order that others be free. But those who share the view of liberal education that I've sketched in my concluding remarks this evening will agree with Aristotle that the best human life is the freest, and that, like all excellent things, it is both difficult and rare. Freedom, in the sense in which I have defined it, is the possession of only a few. And though a liberal education is no guarantee that one will find it, it is a very great help to those who understand the importance of the search. It is also a blessing of an especially precious kind, as the lucky beneficiaries of such an education know better than anyone else. Thank you very much.
The question really is still focused on the tension between the classical liberal arts education and the orientation and the purpose of the research university, which has expanded and grown and led to increased specialization among the faculty. So the idea of the liberal arts education you outline is an abstract one. And yet the people who would teach in the liberal arts college, say at Cornell, where I am from,
Right.
are the specialists.
Right.
And we as specialists, all of us define courses that are reflective of what we know from our specialization to a large extent. And sometimes we do teach courses that fit the liberal arts education in the abstract classical sense, but it turns on the question of core curriculum, it seems. What is the core of that liberal arts education in terms of the actual courses taught, and who would teach these beyond the specialist?
Right. Well, you have put your finger on a point of especially acute tension between the ideal of liberal learning, as I've described it, on the one hand, and the conditions of work in the modern research university. The faculty, not only of the world's great research universities, but of its liberal arts colleges as well, are today almost all graduates of PhD programs, specialists in their own chosen field. They have learned to think of themselves and to value themselves as specialists in one particular corner of the vast world of things that one might study. And many profess to be either unequipped or disinclined to teach in a broad, general program of liberal education of the kind I had in mind in my talk this evening. I know, for example, from my own experience at Yale, I teach in a freshman program called Directed Studies, which is a classical great books program of the sort that once existed at many colleges and universities around the States. It is difficult each year to recruit faculty to teach in the program. This means time away from research. Even if they're attracted to the idea, they say, who am I to teach such a course? I know a little bit about Dante, but you want me to teach Dante and Virgil and Homer to boot? I know nothing about these things. I would be ashamed of myself to. This is a problem. On the other hand, it has also been my experience that there are plenty of teachers at Yale and elsewhere who are distinguished scholars, specialists in their field, who love to get into the classroom with raw beginners, with freshmen and sophomores who are just being introduced to their subject for the first time, and who thrive on the excitement of taking that first step with them, and who understand very well the value of a broadly based, non-specialized program of the kind that I was meant to defend in my remarks tonight. So, and of course, NYU Abu Dhabi and the new liberal arts college that Yale is in the process of helping to create with the National University of Singapore in Singapore are attempts to solve the riddle or the puzzle or to meet the challenge that you've described, to recruit first-rate faculty at the top of their field, which means, by definition, research specialists who have an eye and an appetite for this kind of program and understand its value and will derive some, maybe a great deal, of satisfaction from their participation in it without having to give up their identity and persona as research scholars. I really do think that you can have most of your cake and eat it too. I've seen it done, and I think once we get over the mental hurdle of believing that there is just an intolerable conflict between these, we can go ahead and actually do it, and it will work.
I'd like to know, when do you think that liberal education starts? Specifically, I wonder if the public school system is actually part of that tension. I would think that it would be working against the liberal education. I mean, I don't know if you think that.
Well, tell me why you think that, and I will.
Well, I think a public school has a set curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that there is a freedom for the child.
Right.
I think there's. I just don't think that there's the freedom there.
You're right. You're right about that. There's just so much that you have to. There's so much you have to pack into these young minds before they'll be prepared to cross the threshold and start college, that there isn't a lot of time for the sort of critical reflection that I was talking about this evening. But I think there's actually a deeper reason why the ideals of liberal learning are not well suited to an educational program before you come to college, and that is, it presupposes a measure of intellectual and emotional maturity on the part of the students in question. You have to be already a bit grown up and to have maturing convictions and beliefs before your teacher can go to work on those and get you to begin to question them and put them into a critical light. You have to have a developing intellectual personality, if I can put it that way, before it can be subjected to critical review. And I think a 12-year-old, a 14, 15-year-old isn't yet even moderately finished off enough to be disassembled. First you have to build them up and pack their busy little heads with all sorts of wonderful things and let them develop a sense of themselves and their place in the world, and then with compassion and pedagogical generosity start slowly to break down some of those convictions and confidences that they come with when they cross the threshold and begin college at the end of 17 or 18.
Although I arrived a little bit late, but I was fortunate to catch up maybe the general ideas of your talk. I really feel I appreciate what you try to explain for this in this lecture, because it is very important issue actually, although it focuses on the learning and educational environment, but it goes beyond that to the living for all the community members. Yes. It is related to freedom, yes. You know, to bring up people with free thinking, with respect others' opinion, even the young or middle teenager or adults as well. And my question is that I get to believe from previous question that there is a difference between categories in schools of liberal education for youngers. You know, we are in a process of compromising how much we can make them feel free, right, and to adjust the continuity of yes. the actual learning, yes. in general.
Yes.
And as much as they grow up in universities, maybe the area will be more liberal, you know, that they can feel more free to argue, to choose, to that is my understanding. Yes. But at the same time, the title is very fascinating. I mean, liberal with education does not go with the full package, that the curriculum should be also liberal in values, and within the actual learning program there should be something about free thinking, you know, in the values of education. From the teachers, as a matter of principle, he is not a dictatorship in the class. Mm-hmm. So there are values of liberalism in education as a matter of behaviors from teachers, from administrations, you know, within the curriculum. Right. It's a full, you know, process. Right. I would like you to elaborate on this. Thank you.
Thank you. You've said several things with which I emphatically agree, and maybe I can just make a couple of comments in response. I have 4 children of my own, and as their parent, I have been preoccupied from the start with the challenge of striking the right balance between helping them become increasingly free in their lives, on the one hand, and giving them the discipline and structure and order and direction that every small and growing human being needs in order to have a life with a shape at all. Too much freedom too early spoils the child, if I may put it that way, and too little too late does the same. But the balance shifts as the child matures, and by the time they come to us, to their college teachers, their they have hopefully acquired some discipline and structure and regularity in their lives. They're able to look after themselves, and that allows them to, that enables them to open themselves up to challenges and forms of inquiry that for a less developed human being might be threatening, disabling, or just pointless, not really of much value or help at all. Even at the college level, though, we still struggle with striking the right balance between these two. Students, this is my own view now, I'm speaking just for myself, it is very important that I could give you a short list of the things that I think any educated young person graduating from college ought to have some knowledge of. They ought to have studied the natural sciences in some depth, physics and chemistry and biology. They ought to have a broad acquaintance with some a portion of world literature, and so on and so forth. And that's part of what I think of as building up their reservoir of knowledge and competence. But alongside of that, they need to be helped to become freer and freer and freer in their own capacity to confront themselves, to see themselves honestly, and to ask themselves as forthrightly as they can, what do I want in my life? What do I really care about? What's ultimately of value to me? Am I on the right course? Should I shift direction? And striking the right balance between those is complicated. As to your second point, I think two things I would say very briefly. I believe it is important that the faculty of a liberal arts college, to the extent they can, exemplify the ideals of self-reflection and toleration and open-mindedness that they want to encourage their students to acquire themselves. And among other things, that means, as a teacher, being prepared to put your own views and convictions under the microscope and to subject them to the same scrutiny and critical review that you are asking your students to subject their views to. You can't really, I don't think, ask them to do it unless you're prepared, if I may use a metaphor, to get in the pool and to swim along with them. That's the first thing I would say. The second is that liberal, when one hears the phrase liberal education, of course, many people immediately think, well, that means politically liberal. And it is true as a fact that most faculty, at most American institutions at least, let me put it this way, there are more registered Democrats than Republicans among college and university teachers in the United States. Draw from that whatever conclusions you wish. But the ideal of liberal learning, as I've described tonight, is actually a very conservative ideal. And it was in part to underscore that, without actually saying it, that I invoked the authority of Aristotle at the beginning of my talk, who's not only a very old guy, but was a deeply conservative thinker himself.
Thank you. As a student of NYU Abu Dhabi, I think that receiving a liberal arts college sometimes means that going to classes or subjects that you don't necessarily like it very much. Mm-hmm. So how do you think of the balance between like the broad range of knowledge a student gets and the student's interest in those academic subjects?
Well, I think I would say two things. First of all, you should have, and I know you do have here, given the way the curriculum is structured, lots of opportunities to pursue your own interests while if I may put it this way, being made to take a bunch of other courses that you may or may not find to your liking. So there's a lot of room to do what you want and to follow your interests. But having said that, first of all, the interests that you come in with, that you have or think you have at the start, may turn out a year or 2 or 3 down the road to be very far afield of the interests that have taken shape during the time that you've been in college. And one of the things that your education here should do is force you to put your initial convictions under that microscope and to reflect on whether this really is where your heart and mind are. Maybe something else that you've done that you hadn't expected to find quite as exciting as you did is where you want to go. The last thing I would say, maybe the most important, is it shouldn't be necessary that you like every course. Some courses, a course can be unlikable for lots of different reasons. It can be unlikable just because it's hard and you don't have much taste for it. Perhaps a mathematician may feel that way about a course in art history, and an art historian about a course in calculus. But it's good for the soul to be made to do some things that you don't like. There's another way of not liking a course, and that is you don't feel comfortable. You know, ideas that you believe in deeply are up for grabs. They're being challenged and questioned by others in the class or and that can make you feel very uneasy. And you'd like to get out of the room and go back to your comfortable habits. But you shouldn't. And again, it's good for your soul to be made to sit in that class, and if you feel uneasy, to speak up and say why. That's tough. That's so much harder than just getting up and walking out. But that's part of what a liberal education is meant to do, to embolden you to speak up when you're uneasy. And that will help you to discover why you're uneasy and maybe cause some others in the room to feel uneasy in turn. Yeah.
Thank you. I 2 or 3 years ago, I read and enjoyed Education's End, so thank you for your comments tonight. The title of your address, The Case for Liberal Education, suggests an argument that needs to be made,
right,
and that needs to convince someone.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just wondering if we were to empty the room of the choir to whom you've just preached,
yeah.
and replace this audience with 50 other people to whom this case needs to be made,
Yeah.
who would they be?
I think mostly faculty, and perhaps some students who are teetering on the edge of deciding between going into a more vocationally oriented program or a classical liberal arts program of the kind that NYU Abu Dhabi offers. But it's the faculty, I think, mainly that need convincing. And I say that based on my own experience at Yale and elsewhere. Students in the room, forgive me for what I'm about to say. An 18-year-old, 17 or 18-year-old, doesn't know what to be puzzled about. And if you say, you ought to be puzzled about this, say, okay, I'm puzzled about that. You are, my dear students, extraordinarily malleable as far as that goes. So many students really don't need a lot of convincing to be persuaded that a program of the sort that I've described is going to be really exciting, maybe a little unnerving, but fun and liberating in the ways that I've suggested. But the faculty, especially at a research university, who define themselves in the way we were the first person who spoke was suggesting, define themselves in terms of their disciplinary position, their scholarly work, and the like. Harder often to persuade them that this is something really not just permissible, it's okay if you go off and do it, but please don't ring my bell. I'd like not to have anything to do with it, but absolutely essential, and to draft them into it. That's hard. That's very, very difficult. Because you run against the grain of their own professional self-conception. But at the same time, as I said before, at the bottom of the soul of most research specialists, there is, I believe, an appetite, a yearning to get back in the classroom with the raw recruits and to lead them into the wonder of classical mechanics or Greek philosophy or Chinese painting or whatever it is that has caught your heart and mind so profoundly that you've decided to devote your life to it. How could you not want to pass that passion along? I don't understand it. And I think actually there are thousands, tens of thousands of research specialists who in their heart really feel that way too. And they just have to be liberated they have to be allowed to be that part of themselves. So I'd gather them in the room, and then actually I'd lock the doors until they had signed a contract or something of the kind. Yeah.
And especially about the question where do you think does a liberal education start? And I feel like coming from a place where the approach to education, not in just higher education, but secondary schools is much different from the one that you're describing.
Right.
I personally feel like the work has to start much earlier than the suggestion. College, as you say, a person needs to mature and have the ideas formed before we go and challenge them.
Yeah.
But I came from a school where you have to decide certainly your major or your specialization in 10th grade, when you have to decide whether you're going to be a science student or an art student. So for me, coming to an education where the kind of values that you're promoting are the default education system, I would not benefit much out of it than a person who comes from a place where that idea was promoted. So I feel like this broad-based idea of education would be more applicable if it was promoted maybe at an earlier age.
Yeah. Well, you make a very good point. In many countries, perhaps the majority, educational tracking, vocational tracking, begins at a very early age. Kids are asked to declare, or they get tested and told what they ought to do and set off in a particular direction. And I would say, in many cases, prematurely frozen into a path, and as a result deprived of the opportunity to ask themselves at a slightly later stage in their lives, when they're a bit more mature, what do I really want to do? Rather than waking up at the age of 22 or 25 and finding out that I'm already once and for all of this or a that. Often in many educational systems, secondary school systems, the kids who are not tracked, who are allowed to continue on in a more generalized and non-vocational way, are marked out as being the elite few. The ones who don't have to declare a vocational preference and prepare for their life of work at the age of 13 or 14. I said in my talk tonight that there is something inevitably elitist about liberal education, but the selection of the few, if I can put it that way, it shouldn't come too soon. and too early. If it does, it's not only unfair, it's crippling, and it deprives so many human beings of the opportunity to taste what freedom of a deeper kind might mean for them. But this is a huge undertaking to reform the world's secondary school systems along the lines, I think, that would be more in keeping with your remarks. So this will be your assignment when you graduate from NYU Abu Dhabi.
What, if anything, is the role of liberal education in conjunction with work to help teach someone, particularly a student, to exercise their talents and guide them to meaningful pursuits?
Okay. This, in a way, your question goes back to the distinction that I drew at the very beginning of my talk between what Aristotle calls the theoretical disciplines or arts on the one hand and the practical ones on the other. And I think I would say this in response to your question. The point comes when even the most liberally educated, in my sense, young man or woman needs to test their fledgling powers of observation and judgment and self-criticism in the context of some actual enterprise. I don't mean enterprise in the narrow sense of business. I mean some structured human activity where people are trying to do something concrete, and the pressures of life, of real life, are working on everyone engaged in the project. You have to come back down to earth. That's we live on Earth most of the time, anyway, and there is. Your 4 years as a student in a liberal arts program is a wonderful speculative timeout from life. And the timeout is to equip you to live freely. But you must return to life at some point, sooner or later. I've tried to avoid that all my life. So far, I wouldn't say I haven't succeeded. But everyone must and does in one way or another, and this is part of your education too. And in the process of in your encounter with the demands of practical life, you will be compelled inevitably to revisit and revise the conception of yourself that you've begun to fashion in the course of your education. And you will be going for the rest of your life back and forth between thinking about yourself, continuing that speculative, reflective enterprise that you began in college, and trying to work things out in the life that you're actually living. And if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you'll be able to bring these into some modest degree of alignment for a longish period of time. That's the most for which any human being is entitled to ask, I would say.
This is more about something that you said earlier, where it's important to have structure at an early stage in life. But I think, isn't it true that in the earlier stages, along with that structure, it's very, very important to teach children and young children at almost any age to see things in more than black and white, and that's what will, continue their creativity or keep them able to accept whatever they're going to learn in college. If their minds are shut down in the beginning, they won't be able to see in more than two colors.
Right. Absolutely right. Let me. Will you forgive me if I invoke my children, my own children, again a second time? I couldn't begin to count the times when a question came up over the dinner table or on the playground, wherever, about whether something was right or wrong. And some of the time, the answer was absolutely clear. This was wrong or this was right. You just shouldn't do that. That was a bad thing to do, or that was a good and generous thing to do, and you get a pat on the back for it. And it was very important, I thought, for my kids to have a clear sense of what's right and wrong in those situations. But there were lots of other situations in which they would start the conversation by saying, oh, so-and-so is such a jerk, and he did this or that. And I'd say, well, let's wait a minute. Tell me a little bit more. And the conversation would go on, and ambiguities would emerge, and it would turn out that it wasn't all black and white. Or at least my ambition as the moral educator of my kids was to get them to see that the situation was more complex. It had more dimensions and more sides to it, more shades than they had initially thought. And of course, and I tried to strike the right balance between those two things. And the effort to do that doesn't stop at 6 or 8 or 10 or 15. I don't know that it ever stops, but certainly that is a very important part of the moral education that young people receive or ought to receive in a liberal arts college such as this one too. They should be constantly wrestling in class and outside of class, in their discussions with their friends and classmates, wrestling with the question of deciding what's a genuine ambiguity and what isn't. And that's that line itself is not always black and white. But the sign, to my mind, the sign of a mature human being is their capacity to deal with that dilemma in a thoughtful and responsible way, and to be able to give an account to themselves and to other people of how they've managed to strike the right balance between courage and commitment and conviction on the one hand, and a tolerance for ambiguity and variety and difference on the other.
I'm a student in Zayed University, and I couldn't help but notice you mentioned Cicero in one of your while you were speaking, and one of his writings was civic duties, which you mentioned that we all need to pay attention to the civic duties that we have towards the world that we live in.
Right.
And in a world that we live in, the borders are becoming much less than they are before. Anyone can just. I can talk to my brother in the States while we're all having lunch at home, and it's a wonder how technology now works.
It's amazing.
So now we have a clash of civilizations, according to Amy Chua, between a lot of these civilizations. And how can we translate what Cicero put in the civic duties into the world that we live in today, due to the much friction that's happening between all the civilizations in the world we live in?
Yeah, a great question. This challenge is what I had in mind in my talk when I spoke of global citizenship, the challenges of global citizenship. And if I can make a connection between your question, your comment, and the last one, I would say the following. I don't like the phrase clash of civilizations very, very much. It would be foolish to deny that there are points of friction in the world, political, economic, cultural. But we had better find a way of accommodating them and living with them if we're to survive in a world that has knit us together now. In the ways that you described. And it seems to me at the heart of that challenge, the challenge of global citizenship, is the question of figuring out on a planetary scale what it is we can all agree about as fundamental principles about which there is not and must not be any disagreement on the one hand, and where on the other disagreements and differences should be allowed and indeed perhaps even encouraged. And that's a tough line to draw. Let me be a little bit more concrete about that. For anyone who believes in anyone who believes that there are fundamental human rights, which men and women everywhere on the planet possess as their birthright, regardless of the particular state into which they happen by the accident of birth to have come, to find themselves. Anyone who believes that believes that there are certain absolutes. Let me call these global absolutes that must be honored and respected everywhere. Of course, when you ask, okay, I agree, now what's on your list of human rights? I'll tell you what's on mine, what's on yours. The going gets a little tougher, for sure, no question about that. But at least I think we can all agree on the first few items and begin to construct a list that's richer than that. But within the framework of those agreed upon universal, non-negotiable principles of morality, of human morality, there is and must be lots of space for variety to flourish and to be relished by all of us. And it will fall to you and your generation to build that architecture, to build the house that we will all have to live in. And I say have to live in, that we will want to live in, because it will be, when it comes, a fulfillment of something that even Cicero, who was a cosmopolitan thinker, aspired to. I would say dimly, but now you can make Cicero breathe. Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the evening. Yeah.